Awesome.
More alarmed. Courts are closed off to us on the federal level.
Yeah.
And we're defensive because even though we're not active, still doing some mitigation, but not in areas where we know we can't. But that means like we but they did the schools. They are
Pretty good.
They hire we're more complicated, even if we know
And
we're
there are
losing
terrible
case.
cases, and you know, you can.
We have to take the school district deserve the best reputation they could get, and that's what we try to give it. As much as we could, limit the damage, you know, if we can. They didn't overturn the school court cases yet, so.
Right.
It's just.
There's no question about how those cases.
Oh, yeah, you know.
Like that case, I mean, no question at all.
The only question was how far we go.
Well, I think that Oklahoma case shows how far it will go. I think that's just. Hold on a second.
Oh. I don't know. Don't come in. I like you to sit down.
Thank you. Lady.
Y'all have water.
So, yeah, I think that shows. Although they're, you know, should they
Well, we cross off, I mean, how many, we had a case a couple years ago, where a charter school in Arizona, so that down, you know, we challenged that. Their teachers, that was, I can't remember the name of it.
like in
Yeah, it was in Arizona, it was one of these like heritage academies.
Yeah, I think I wrote about that.
Yeah, you probably did, yeah. But, you know, who knows?
Traveling or
What might be going on sometime next week. Traveling around the country,
so
public
this
charters.
is the end of it, except I have
I know.
Policing what's going on.
Well, the amazing thing is that so many of them are involved in some
lobby at the Capitol.
financial states, especially that have sort of their elected
Check,
officials.
check, check. One, two. One, two. Check. One, two. Check, check, check. One, two, three. This is 1, 2, 3. One.
Tight fitting pants were cool, so I would wear them, and then now kids don't. Sweat pants are cool again.
What's this called?
You know, the sweatpants where you can like see your socks. Yeah. You know, like your daughter probably, like, you know, you walk around college campuses, everybody's pants are like too big and too short.
Also flares.
Yeah, yeah.
Too big and too short. I know.
Right? We'll be doing that.
2, 3, 1.
Great, thank you.
Just do your mic. What's your name?
One, two, three. One, two, three.
Sorry.
Yeah. Brian. Yeah, go for it. Okay.
All right, welcome. Good to see everybody. I'm glad you all made it. I'm glad you're all, some of you, I know, were taking a nap and you almost didn't get up. So, yeah, I know. I see some pillow lines on some faces. All right, so if you're with us online, I want to welcome you to the Summer for Religious Freedom. Everyone's waving, and we're here just at the tail end of our weekend. It's been an incredible time together, inspiring, magnetic, and just really, really, really dynamic. So what we're going to do is for the next half hour, we're going to talk. I'm going to get to talk with this amazing group of people who's sitting next to me. We're going to take some questions, and then if you're here in person, we're going to do a book signing. And if you're not here in person, you're going to wish you were, but you know, you'll have to get the books later. So let me introduce some folks who are next to me, and then we'll get started. So Immediately next to me is Andrew Seidel, who works here at Americans United and is the author of American Crusade, How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom, and also The Founding Myth. Next to Andrew is Katherine Stewart, author of The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. And on the far side is Rob Boston, who is also part of Americans United on staff here, and is the author of a number of books, most recently, Taking Liberties, Why Religious Freedom Doesn't Give You the Right to Tell Others What to Do. So the theme of the summit this weekend is religious freedom, as well as the separation of church and state. So Rob, I'm gonna start with you. You've been observing and analyzing the religious right for decades. You were writing about Pat Robertson as the most dangerous man in America before many people realized that, I think. Can you just tell us, how have we gone through a transformation over the last quarter century where religious liberty becomes something that you're doing, you're exercising, to telling others what to do and telling others what they can and cannot do?
Yeah, thanks for that. I remember maybe it was the late 80s, early 90s, I was at a hearing in Congress, a congressional hearing, and it was supposedly about religious liberty. And one of the witnesses was a fellow named Richard John Newhouse, who had written a book called The Naked Public Square. And Newhouse at the time was a Lutheran pastor, later converted and became Catholic and was a priest. But Newhouse presented his theory of religious freedom, which was that the First Amendment's religion clauses were really just one clause. Everything was subservient to free exercise of religion. And the Establishment Clause was just this little afterthought. And I remember at the time sitting in that hearing thinking, man, this guy's really out there. What a kook. But here we are, some years later, decades later, and that has essentially been embraced by the U.S. Supreme Court. As much as I deplore what Christian nationalists have done politically and legally, I have to kind of tip my hat to their tenacity. They build institutions, political groups, like the Moral Majority and later the Christian Coalition and now the Family Research Council and American Family Association and a host of others to influence the political system. They build a host of legal organizations like Alliance Defending Freedom and First Liberty and a host of others again to influence the courts. They also tried to influence the culture. They had less success with that, but that didn't matter because the political system and the judicial system are the ones that are really going to decide these things for us. So we have a situation where I think a majority of Americans don't necessarily agree with what's happening, but thanks to this confluence of this political activity and this judicial activism, we are seeing a situation where Newhouse's vision of religious freedom as a tool of discrimination and a tool that tells others what to do instead of being something that protects an individual right is reigning supreme, which from my perspective just turns the religion clauses absolutely on their head.
Katherine, if we turn to you, I think for me, one of the defining features of your writing, The Power Worshippers and other places, is your ability to zoom us into the movement on the ground and then analyze what it all means. And I'd like to ask you, what does the organizing and funding that Rob just talked about look like in these cases? What are the ways that the institutions that he just mentioned are built? How is the money and the people power funneled from churches, parachurch organizations, think tanks, denominations, networks that end up, as we'll talk with Andrew in a minute, in court cases and other places?
Thanks. It's really wonderful. This is on. Great. Thank you so much for the questions. I also just want to thank everybody here for attending this Religious Freedom Summit. This has really been quite a wonderful experience, and I'm really honored to be in such a wonderful group. So that's a few questions. I want to sort of break it down. First, I want to talk about the fact that this is a leadership-driven movement and an organization-driven movement. And then we can talk a bit about the funding, building and funding of these different features of the organization, the organizational infrastructure. So, the ideology of Christian nationalism is really a tool for this leadership-driven and organization-driven political movement. And the movement, as you alluded to, Rob, has these different, you can sort of group these different organizations into categories. So you have a right-wing legal advocacy sphere with groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which has an annual operating budget of, I believe it's $102 million in last fiscal year. First Liberty, Liberty Council, the Federalist Society, which plays an outsized role in grooming and promoting justices with the correct ideological approaches. You have right-wing policy groups that seek to shape public opinion, like Family Research Council, Heritage and its activist arm, Heritage Action, American Family Association, and the like. You have networking organizations like the Council for National Policy, which gets different heads of different organizations on the same page and brings them together with some of the movement's very deep-pocketed funders. You have very sophisticated data initiatives, legislative initiatives, and of course a vast sort of far-right messaging sphere that spreads not only this idea of grievance politics, often spreads sort of propaganda and tries to get the rank and file sort of on the same page and brings the messaging to them. And each of these different features of the movement plays a role in the funding. I mean, there are just vast amounts of money that flow through the legal advocacy sphere. There's a really terrific expose in the Washington Post a few years ago that showed between 2014 and 2017 alone, hundreds of millions of dollars flowed through not just the Federalist Society, but a range of related organizations. You have groups like I want to talk a little bit about funding. The movement has three sources of funding. The first is deep-pocketed donors. Second is small dollar donations from the rank and file. A lot of the daily activity of the movement is in raising those small dollar donations. And then a third source is public money. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. I want to talk a little bit about the first one because it's so impactful, especially in the legal sphere. Without the deep-pocketed donors like the DeVos Prince family juggernaut, or the Green family, the Wilkes brothers, Harlan Crow. We can think about the Richard Uihlein, I hope I'm pronouncing his name properly, the foundations of the late Skype and others. Too many to mention, really. The movement would not be what it is today. And then you have donor-advised groups like the National Christian Foundation, which disperses, I believe it's $1.5 billion over the last couple of years. So we're talking about vast amounts of money that flow through this ecosystem. And a lot of money buys a lot of law. Movement has lawyers that they can sort of throw at these cases, money that they can throw at these cases. And what they do with this money is strategists will come up with novel legal building blocks that are intended to ultimately degrade the separation of church and state, eviscerate the Establishment Clause, and enshrine policies that they want into law and into our society.
You just said something that I think is really worth considering. A lot of money buys a lot of law, and I want to turn to you, Andrew, and ask about how a lot of money buys a lot of Supreme Court justices. And not to summarize your book there, but in American Crusade, you take us through just a number of case studies and how this works. And so, Rob and Katherine really talked about kind of the institution building and the funding. Would you be willing to take us through one case study that exemplifies how the claims for religious liberty that we're seeing are not really about freedom, but more about bigotry?
Sure. First, let's just set the table a little bit, because we have seen over the last decade the weaponization of religious freedom, turning that shield that protects each and every one of us into a weapon that allows the chosen few, conservative white Christian men, to impose their religion on everybody else. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the weaponization of religious freedom. And they are litigating the legal meaning of that constitutional right and perverting it, so that instead of protecting you, it allows them to impose their religion on you. And the striking thing about all of the cases that we've seen over the last 10 years is how easy they would be to solve if the judges were fair and unbiased. I mean, these are not hard legal questions most of the time. They're actually really easy to answer. And that to me is one of the key blaring, flashing red lights suggesting that there is something else, everything that Katherine is talking about that's going on here, right? I mean, you just draw 3 basic lines and you've solved all these questions. The first, there's a difference between action and belief. Okay? Your right to believe is absolute. Your right to act on that belief is not. I mean, and we've heard this a couple times this weekend, right? Your right to swing your fist ends at the other person's nose. Your right to swing your religion ends at the other person's rights, right? Religion has never been a license to harm somebody else or to impose or violate their rights. And that is the thing that we are seeing change. So first, there's a difference between action and belief. And that second line that we draw is that, okay, if the government can step in and say, no, you don't get to act on this just because it's religious, well, where is it okay for the government to step in? And it is where the rights of other people begin. And those 2 lines answer most of the questions that have come up before the Supreme Court. And the third line that we draw is the line between church and state. And those 3, they answer everything that we've seen recently. And to me, the case that is the most striking as a case study for the weaponization of religious freedom, at least lately. I mean, there's so many to choose from, but I think the one that probably exemplifies what Katherine and Rob have been talking about is the Kennedy versus Bremerton case. This is the case that Americans United helped the school district of Bremerton litigate all the way up to the Supreme Court. This is the coach who was imposing his personal prayers on other people's children at the 50-yard line of football games. Right? We know for a fact, it was in the record, that those kids felt like they had to pray to play at a public school. That is undisputed. And at the appellate court level, you had judges who, before the conservative legal movement really orchestrated this hostile takeover of our courts, judges who were appointed and confirmed, who wrote in the opinion, they actually compared the claims that First Liberty Institute, one of the groups Katherine mentioned, was making against reality in like a 2-column grid. I've never seen that before in a legal opinion. That one of the judges warned that First Liberty Institute was spinning a, quote, deceitful narrative. A deceitful narrative. If a judge wrote that about me in a court opinion and published it, I would retire. I would go bury my head. Like, as a lawyer, like we have, I know lawyers get a bad rap, but as a lawyer, you have like very high ethical standards that you have to follow. And if a court basically called me a liar, I mean, I would turn tail and run. I would certainly take some extra ethics classes. They appealed to the Supreme Court. I mean, think about what that means. An appellate judge said you're spinning a deceitful narrative, and they appealed to the Supreme Court with the same narrative. And the court bought it. I mean, that should be just absolutely shocking to each and every one of us here. And in the end, the court decided the case in favor of that coach and on religious freedom grounds. And that has created all kinds of confusion in the public schools right now that AU is working to deal with. But I mean, this is just one example of what we are seeing, and it's not even the end because there is no amount of privilege, and the weapon of religious freedom will never be powerful enough for them. They will not stop until we stop them.
I'll just add briefly that one of the things I've heard you say often, Andrew, and you write this, of course, is that talking to Christian nationalists, we're not coming for your rights, we're coming for your privilege. And what I can tell you, as somebody who used to be in the movement and now studies that movement every day, there's 2 roles that folks in these movements play. And Lauren Kirby outlines this really well in Saving History. One is as founders of the country. We founded the place. How dare you challenge that? And if you do challenge it, we're now victims. And we're the only actual and real victims. And so when someone outlines things like you have just done, Andrew, it's not I'm going to go bury my head in the sand because I'm so embarrassed. It is I can't believe the persecution we're facing in a country that's lost its way from God. We are victims. We are being just absolutely, hunted as people of faith, right? So, all right, here's what we're gonna do, and I know.
I just want to add
please.
one thing real quick. One thing testing. Okay. One thing real quick. Dear American Christian nationalists, we're not coming for your rights, we're coming for your privilege, is the dedication page to American Crusade, which is available here today, and if I look for it everywhere, and I'm happy to sign if you want. Okay, continue.
Here I thought you were just going to take what I had said, add something brilliant.
I'm here to hawk.
And it was a commercial. Oh my God. Okay, so what we're going to do is give people hope in 1 second. We're going to talk about the ways that we are fighting, that we are organizing. But before we do that, I want to ask a question, and that's this. We've done a lot of historical work at this conference. We've talked a lot about what is taking place since the 50s or the 60s or the 90s or during the Trump presidency. I want to focus on the future real quick because I think it can sometimes be something that we don't lose sight of, but the urgency may slip from our minds at times. When it comes to religious liberty, Bible in schools, mandatory religious practice in schools, reproductive rights, trans rights, free and fair elections. What does a Trump or DeSantis or GOP presidency / control of Congress look like from 2024 to 2032? Just give me one issue. We're going to do hope in a minute, okay? But we got to do this first, all right? So Rob, what do you think?
That would not be good. Okay, Catherine.
Well, you mentioned a number of issues there. One issue that's interested me over the years is the proper role of religion in public education. Because you can teach about religion as an academic subject, and students absolutely have the right to engage in voluntary religious activity and reading of religious text on their free time. But to have organized, coercive forms of prayer, that's been unconstitutional since 1962. Now, that decision and the subsequent 63 decision were not overturned by the Supreme Court in the Bremerton case. But, 8 more years of this, who knows? We could lose that 60-year-old precedent. And then you're talking about public schools that essentially become the parochial school system for whatever religion happens to dominate in a given area. Be a disaster.
Thank you so much, Susan. So much to add to that, but we'll be brief. I'll take on reproductive rights for now. Don't be fooled by the Supreme Court sort of punting on the Mifepristone. This is a movement that is determined to ban all abortions from the moment of conception, or as I often hear at these national pro-life summits and right to life marches, from the moment of fertilization. They want to ban all abortions, but it's really linked to the assault on reproductive rights and bodily autonomy is linked to a broad range of rights. They won't be satisfied with banning abortions. They will go after various forms of birth control. This will reach very deep, not only into maternal medicine, where we already have a shocking and disgraceful level of maternal deaths in our country. If you look at the graphs over the last couple of years, it's like a hockey stick. It's going up as more and more restrictions come into play. But it's going to affect, they're not just going to go after women having abortions. They're going to go after friends, family, mail carriers, internet service providers, anybody who participates in the obtaining of an abortion. And, I go to these right-wing and, anti-abortion gatherings, and you hear the leaders speaking. They are adamant that they want to ban abortion all over the country. They don't see this as a quote-unquote states' rights issue. It's always been this sort of incremental chipping away. The Supreme Court is a very, I think, politically sensitive body. They're like, they're oh gosh, well, we're afraid of the backlash, but with another, depending on what happens in 2024, I think we could see them sort of carry out that agenda completely, and that's very frightening.
I would agree with both of those for sure. Public schools, I'm deeply worried about. I mean, Christian nationalists are not just out to get vouchers and to get prayer into schools. They're trying to destroy the public school system. Read Katherine's books if you are not familiar with some of that. I mean, that is one of the goals of vouchers. Certainly, I concur on reproductive rights. Right, the end of Roe is just the beginning. They're coming for contraception, as she said. They're coming for everything. And I mean, I'm also deeply worried for my LGBTQ friends and family. I mean, they're coming for marriage equality, and they may even have the votes on the Supreme Court to do it. You know, people forget that the only time John Roberts read a dissent from the bench was in the Obergefell decision. And you can go listen to it online right now. I mean, he is an angry person reading that dissent. And you know, they don't even need him to overturn it. So that is clearly the front I think that they want to fight on. They are looking at our trans brothers and sisters and siblings and saying we can divide the other side by targeting them. And that is one of the things they are trying to do. And if we're not careful, they'll be successful at it.
I just want to talk briefly about state houses, and you know, there was an attempt in 2022 to elect folks who were election deniers to you know, to be secretaries of state and so on, and that was fought tooth and nail and largely successful. Jennifer as well in Colorado and other folks really were leading that fight. But I think ignoring how state legislatures are a part of the puzzle for a federal takeover is a big mistake. And I think there's a long-term plan too to make sure that if you control enough state legislatures, you can send fake electors, right? You can talk about independent state legislature theory. You can talk about passing constitutional amendments and so on and so forth. So, all right, we have a couple minutes before we're going to start questions, but I just want to ask now and turn to Hope and ask everybody, what is one either solution or way forward, or what is one thing you're seeing in terms of momentum or organizing that is giving you hope for the future?
Yeah, on the question of hope, despite how dire we have sounded tonight, there is hope. There absolutely is hope. Look at the backlash of this building. You know, the America that the Supreme Court is trying to foist onto us is an America that does not work for this nation right now. And it certainly isn't going to work for it in the years to come. You can see this backlash building. When red states like Kentucky and Kansas vote by popular referendum to support abortion rights, when a red wave that we were supposed to see in the midterms elections fizzles out, when voters in Wisconsin go to the polls and put a progressive jurist on the Supreme Court and tip the balance, when the election deniers, as Brad indicated, who were, you know, many people thought would win, in fact lose, there is grounds for hope. Now, understand me, this is going to be a long-term project. You need to be in this for the long haul. We are not going to get this back overnight, but we will get it back. If you think of Christian nationalism as a disease, the cure is separation of church and state. So our task is to rebuild that wall, as I said in the panel this afternoon, day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, brick by brick. And I urge you, all of you, to be with us for the long haul in this project.
Thank you so much. That was amazing, and I agree. We can't fight this situation unless people really know what they're up against. And I'm seeing more and more folks really understand what we're up against. I'm seeing folks who are more willing to engage in the in the work of democracy building. I think that who are actually engaging in the political process in meaningful ways. When I started writing about these issues back in 2010, 2011, a lot of folks just weren't aware. They would say, "What are you talking about? Obama's the president." Like, I don't know what you're talking about. And now everybody really gets it. I think post January 6th, post Dobbs, a lot of people finally woke up. And I think that awareness is the first step. But I'm also seeing more strategizing, more of an emphasis on doing the actual work of building a democracy and defending democracy.
It's so lovely to be on this panel because just awesome. Anyway, go to au.org/pledge. You can sign our pledge. That will bring you into an activist pipeline. We're going to ladder you up to get you working to defend the separation of church and state. This is a pledge, one nation, all beliefs, that we're going to take this country back for all of us. We're going to take it back from the white Christian nationalists. And to me, the thing that I really do have hope about is I mean, both of you touched on this, is every time they win, because they are fighting for just this small group of people, they're fighting for minority rule. That's what you're talking about when you're talking about them conquering the legislatures, right? They are fighting for conservative, white, heterosexual men, Christian men, to have the power and to be the only ones who are truly protected under our law. So every time they win, they are alienating more people. Every time the court decides in their favor in a case like Dobbs, it is waking more people up to the danger that we face, to the threat that exists, and driving more people into the arms of our movement if we are there ready to catch them. So that is one thing that I think I'm very hopeful about, and we're working desperately to make sure people have a home. And the Summit for Religious Freedom is, kind of going to be that home for activism in the future.
I'll just say I get a chance to talk to young people quite a bit as a college professor, and here at the Summit, I had a chance to interview several of the AU student fellows, and they give me a lot of hope. And I'll tell you, both of the folks who I interviewed come from places that we would consider red states. And if you listen to my show and you've heard me talk, I really don't like that way of categorizing things. Reverend Barber says there's no red states, there's oppressed states, right? And so the folks that we talked to this weekend are in places like Missouri, places like Tennessee, where from afar you might think, well, things have gotten really, really, really deeply right-wing there in a short amount of time. And yet on the ground, there are people organizing. On the ground, there are people finding ways to be in solidarity, to not give up, and to say that if we are together, there's always hope, right? And I think that's my encouragement if you're watching online or if you're here this weekend is fatigue sets in when you're alone and when you allow the bad news to just seep in. Energizing and dynamism happens when you're together with others. And it's not about a short-term victory, okay? And I just agree with Rob and everyone else that if you think this is, Christian nationalism is a disease, and we're going to take some antibiotics, get that out of our system, and then we'll be back to playing golf and tennis and having a great time. It's not like that, okay? It's not a cold that the nation gets over. It's a continual threat that the body politic here will face as long as any of us in the room are living and beyond, I am sure. So there's deep hope for me in the places that look like there is least hope, because there are people there who are finding ways, creative ways to fight back. All right, we want to now open up questions from the audience and folks who want to interject into the conversation. So if you have a question, feel free to signal me, and I'll try to get to you as soon as we can. So, okay, Jesse.
Do you want a microphone? So we have to sit here and tolerate while we wait. We have to tolerate trans youth and trans people committing suicide while they wait for healthcare. We have to tolerate women dying, waiting for abortion procedures. We have to tolerate this. What is our actual breaking point before we start screaming? I mean, it's just, it makes me so angry because it's a toleration of this stuff, because it is just, we have to wait. It's a waiting procedure until something's done in the courts, because we do it legally, we do it the right way, we do everything the right way, but we tolerate everything until then.
So if you're with us online, I just want to reiterate the question. The question is, what is the breaking point? Because there are moments of tolerating the pain and the oppression that feel as if they just lead to a place of being unbearable. So what is the strategy for coping with that, and how does one do that?
I just want to say that we didn't get here overnight. We didn't get to this place. The movement spent 50 years investing in infrastructure building, starting in the, I would say, late 1970s, early 1980s. They started investing in infrastructure. They started strategizing, and they built their movement gradually and over time. And there's no magic bullet that's going to solve this. I mean, this type of political change takes time, it takes movement building, it takes infrastructure building. You know, sometimes I think about the words of the Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas, whose relatives were enslaved, whose ancestors were enslaved. And she says, you know, she says that, you know, her words give me hope. She said they fought for freedom. They fought for people they knew they were never even going to see, but they fought nevertheless. Now, I think that, you know, we are living in many ways for, you know, many of us still have freedoms, and we still have the ability to act, and we have a responsibility and a duty to act. Not just for ourselves, but for future generations and for people that we will never see.
I often talk about that as planting trees. And you're planting trees, you're never going to enjoy the shade of those trees. It's for future generations. I think that's part of it. I really do think it's worth emphasizing that we are playing and fighting a long game, and we are very behind. The other thing that I heard you mention, Jesse, in your question, and Katherine touched on it in her answer a little bit, is so, you know, I'm a constitutional lawyer, so at these conferences, I get 5-10 times people coming up with really great ideas for new legal arguments that are going to solve this problem. Mm-hmm. And that is not what is going to win us the day here. The courts are not going to save us. And historically, I mean, if you look at our Supreme Court, historically, it's a very conservative and often retrogressive institution. You know, we think of the Warren Court and the Burger Court, the court that gave us Gideon versus Wainwright. You know, you have a right to counsel when you're accused of a crime. That gave us Roe versus Wade. That's the court that we think of. We think of it as this bastion of civil rights. But that's the outlier, right? For most of the court's history as an institution, it has not been that. It has been retrogressive. If anything, it's returning to the mean right now. So we cannot wait for the courts or the lawyers to save us. This has to be a much bigger movement than that. And if you're expecting somebody to just think of this brilliant legal argument under the 14th Amendment, or you know, I've heard it many this weekend, you know, it's not going to happen. Okay, this is going to be organizational. It's going to be building power and changing hearts and minds, and those people that are waking up to the danger of white Christian nationalism, welcoming them into this movement with open arms when they realize the threat that we face.
Oh, let me just say real quick, 1945, my relatives get out of incarceration camps during World War II. If I would have stopped them in the United States, speaking of Earl Warren, right, for Japanese Americans, Earl Warren is not our favorite guy, nor is FDR. Just gotta say it. Okay, I know some of you didn't like that. Okay, 1945, if I say to that uncle, hey, in 20 years, we're gonna have a Voting Rights Act, a Civil Rights Act, we're gonna have sweeping immigration reform that will bring Asian folks into the country in ways we've never seen before. We're gonna have, in 1968, 1969, a racial coalition, a pan-racial coalition in the Bay Area that will give us the birth of ethnic studies, right? And then Black and brown and Asian folks will stand together at San Francisco State. That's all gonna happen, and it's gonna sweep the nation. I think my uncle would have looked at me and said, no, it's not. So it's easy to say, hey, it's 2023. What's gonna happen? It's bleak. Well, what's it gonna look like in 2043? I think that's up to us. Okay, yes, right here, Mike.
Hi. In addition to all the horrors you've described now, there's also the attack on modern science, particularly Darwinian evolution, which is the foundation of modern biology and the life sciences. You can't understand how diseases propagate without understanding evolution. You can't understand how to treat without that. People are questioning the age of the earth. I used to teach science years ago. What can we do to counter this massive attack on modern science, which is killing us in the modern world.
Let me take a shot at that, because that's been an issue that Americans United has worked on for decades. And of course, we stopped the teaching of intelligent design in Dover, Pennsylvania in 2005. Some of you might remember that case. So definitely an issue near and dear to us. One of the things I think we need to do is help folks understand that if their children are not getting a good grounding in evolution in high school or junior high school or whatever grade level, when they go on to college, that's really going to put them at a disadvantage. And it may even choke off access to certain careers for these young people that haven't had this. That there's really no dispute here in the scientific community that this is well established, and that at any public university worth its salt, in the biology department, in the anthropology department, in the physical sciences department, this is going to be taught. Do you really want your child to be at that much of a disadvantage? So you bring it down to a level where folks can kind of understand the practical application, and I think that does help. But yeah, it's definitely challenging. I mean, the polls on this have been getting a little bit better as far as the number of Americans who believe in evolution and accept the reality of it, but we still lag behind a lot of other Western nations. We have a lot of work to do.
One of the phrases that you said that struck me was it's killing us. And I have a chapter in American Crusade, the COVID chapter, about what happened with the COVID cases, and it said religious freedom is killing us is the title. And you really saw the kind of anti-science strain in American society, and especially in white Christian nationalism, come out during the pandemic. And it was held at bay for the most part in the courts until Amy Coney Barrett was pushed onto the court. Even John Roberts wasn't willing to go, not a moderate by any stretch of the imagination, just trying to protect the institutional integrity of the court so he can protect conservative change. That's the only reason he doesn't do some of these things. But he wasn't in favor of allowing religious freedom to trump the law when it came to COVID and pandemic. These health measures that we were taking to prevent people from dying. And you get Amy Coney Barrett onto the court, and all that changes. The change in personnel changed the Constitution. And it's a perfect example of what I was talking about with how easy these cases are to decide, right? Your right to religious freedom is not a right to risk the entire health and safety of your community. It's not. The court decided that hundreds of years ago, or 100 years ago. It was not a hard case. And now all of a sudden we're relitigating this battle. And the giveaway is that when other First Amendment cases were brought, challenging these health measures under free speech, under free assembly, things like that, no court came close to buying it. It's the same rule in the Constitution, but religious freedom was treated differently because it's been weaponized by white Christian nationalists.
Yes, in the back.
So I know that AU and maybe FFRF have programs for legal interns so that they can counter the Federalist Society. And a couple other places where I'm wondering if you could do internships. The press coverage, for instance, Adam Lichtup's coverage of the Bremerton case on the Daily Podcast was abominable. It was full of falsehood. It was terrible. I wrote to them. I never heard any rescinding, nothing. The other place I'm wondering is Theological Seminary. So I wonder if AU would consider maybe having Rob have some writing interns who come in and help with church and state. And how about faith? I know you have a faith advisory group. Could you have interns come into that so that we start spreading the word to people who are interested in journalism and theological careers?
We're already doing a lot of that. We have interns every year at Americans United across departments. I have a writing intern every year. So a lot of that is ongoing. And of course, we have a legal academy where we're working with attorneys and so on. We definitely do see at Americans United that the next generation is going to have to carry forth this battle. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about hope, the long-term nature of this fight. But I don't know. I may not live long enough to see it get back to where I want it to be, but I am damn sure going to make certain that I lay groundwork so I can pass the baton to a new generation that does bring about the change that I want to see.
I have a lot of thoughts on the daily episode that you mentioned. I think it's best if I keep them to myself. You can see me after. I will say, I know, that's why, yeah, it lives forever there, I'm told. I will say that, I think those are wonderful ideas, and as Rob said, we are trying to execute them and make them a reality. If you want to help make them a reality, we could definitely use more funding to help make it a reality. Looking at you folks, everybody, yeah. I mean, honestly, like, getting the younger generation involved in this and building that power for the future is the way that we're gonna win in the long run, and that takes a lot. I mean, you don't, again, you're planting trees, so you do not see the fruits of that for a long time, so it takes a special kind of person to give to those efforts.
Thanks. I just want to add to that, just had a thought, is the movement, the religious nationalists are incredibly youth-focused. If you go to the Road to Majority conference, or if you go to Pray Vote Stand, they'll have a whole separate conference going on for young people, and then they'll have, connecting all these initiatives that connect young people with internships and offer them media training. You have organizations like the Leadership Institute, which offer young people training in various aspects of leadership and media, and they know very well that if you can get the kids, you can get the kingdom. Matt Staver, I remember, referred to young people as strategic machinery, and he was talking about very young people. He was talking about initiatives in public schools. They were trying to they succeeded in forcing some of their initiatives into public elementary schools, targeting very young kids. And he said, if you want to change the direction of the cruise ship, you're going to go after those kids aged 4 to 14, which is the most strategic age group that we have. Now, those of us who are not part of that movement see it as inappropriate to go after other people's children, but certainly being youth-focused in terms of, offering training and internships to college students and people starting out their careers is very important.
Let's mention the youth organizing. Yeah, just Alicia is in the back there. She oversees our youth organizing fellowship at Americans United, and we're currently recruiting for the next cohort for that program. So if you know a young person, what are the ages, Alicia?
18 to 25.
18 to 25 who would like to be involved with that. See her, she can fill you in. It's a great opportunity to get young people involved in this work.
And if you want to learn more about the 4 to 14, the Christian nationalists really going after children, read Katherine's first book, The Good News Club. It's transformative, highly recommended.
There's also a little show called Straight White American Jesus. And we cover Christian nationalism and religious right 3 times a week. And we often compete with the New York Times and Vox and Slate, despite that show being run out of a religion professor's storage closet. So anyway, I might be that religion professor. Question over here. Go ahead. Let's wait for the mic.
So I find that kind of conflicting. They're trying to focus so much on youth, while the leaders in the Christian nationalist movement are trying to raise the voting age from 18 to 21 and are trying to remove voting poll stations from colleges and cut off tools of democracy because they see how infuriated they've made Gen Z. And so can you give a little bit of insights on that and what we do with the fact that Mississippi is bringing back Jim Crow laws and doing very anti-democratic things to make it a democratic state?
Somebody who's in this movement for a long time and worked with youth, I can tell you that there's a deep fear of losing the young people. And there's in reality, a deep understanding that it's really actually hard to hold on to the young people in these movements, right? So there's a lot of effort put into, as Katherine talked about, converting hearts and minds at summer camps at age 6 and getting people involved in political streams at age 15 or 18. However, there's also a stark reality, and I think this goes to what Andrew was talking about, that this is a minority group that has a very hard time holding on to folks who are 18 to 29. It's been like that for a long time. You can read the social science on churches and how that works. So it seems conflicting, and I totally understand what you're saying, but I think it reflects a reality that they know if young people as a whole organize and participate across the country, as we saw in a place like Kansas, right, a couple of months ago, as we saw in an off-season spring election for Supreme Court in Wisconsin a a couple of weeks ago, then you're going to get results that don't favor the white Christian nationalists. And so, of course, they want to raise the voting age. Of course, they don't want, on the whole, young people to participate because they know that's not a demographic that's on their side. This is a graying movement. It doesn't mean it is a movement that is losing any sense of influence or power. Yes?
I wrote this question down, so I'm gonna read it. So I was reading Dark Money by Jane Meyer, which Andrew recommends in American Crusade. And she gets into how a lot of right-wing beliefs are deliberately fed to people, like the billionaires that Katherine had listed earlier. And they're made to seem like they came organically from the public, but they're definitely not. How can you guys expand on that? Or how it applies specifically to Christian nationalists, and what stake do Christian nationalists have?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, do you mind rephrasing the question?
So the concept that some billionaires and really powerful people are kind of feeding ideas into the public and making it seem like it came authentically from the public themselves. And
Top down, not grassroots.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, why do they do it? Is that, well, I'll tell you, I'm sorry? In observing the movement, I think that a lot of the folks who are the big funders, the deep-pocketed funders, are in it, they're as committed, if not more committed, to right-wing economic policy and a broad range of right-wing social policy as they are to right-wing positions in the so-called culture wars. So, but they know that many of those policies will be deeply unpopular to the rank and file. So if you want to get right-wing economic policies that are intensifying economic inequality and putting added stress on American families, how do you get those folks to vote for those policies? Well, you get them to vote on abortion. If you want to implement policies that, that say there should be no environmental protections or low taxes for the rich, or no taxes for the rich, or no regulation of large businesses, how do you do it? You get people in moral panic over trans kids. So I think that's one of the reasons why some of those deep-pocketed funders get involved in those movements. But what they're doing is not funding those ideas themselves. Often what they're doing is funding policy groups or legislative initiatives, or they're funding pastoral initiatives where the messaging about culture war stuff gets transmitted to the rank and file. Look, movement leaders know very well if you can get people to vote on a single issue or 2 or 3 issues, you can control their vote. I'll give you like one example. I was writing about an initiative called Faith Wins, where leaders of the movement, like Chad Connolly of the Council for National Policy and David Barton, who's one of the movement's key myth makers, and others, were going from church to church all across the country. They did hundreds of events, reaching thousands, many thousands of pastors, because each event had, dozens or more pastors at them. And up there they're saying, our culture is in decline, Christians are under attack, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to get your people out to vote. The church is not a cruise ship, the church is a battleship. It's your duty to get your people to vote their biblical values. Well, who's funding this? It's a family, the initiative is partly funded by a family named the Lindsays. And I started researching this family. Who are they? Never heard of them. Well, I found out, they own multiple homes. One of their homes at the time was for sale for $72 million. A $72 million home that was for sale. What their son collects airplanes or flies airplanes or collects, does, he drives race cars.
Not model airplanes, like real
No, real airplanes. This is a family with enormous wealth, and I'm not saying that they don't care about the culture wars, because I think actually the woman in that family truly is, buying, 150% into that, abortion, biblical marriage kind of stuff. But this is also a family with an enormous fortune and is supporting basically a political movement, the religious right, which is, giving them tax policies that will increase their wealth. And what's happened over time, I mean, don't take my word for it, you can look at the sociological data, the economic data. We're living in an era of vast economic inequality, where it's become harder and harder for most American families to succeed and to make it work. So, I hope that this is getting to your question somewhat.
If I could just channel Bernie Sanders here for a minute. One of the biggest challenges we face in this country right now is to help persuade working class folks. And I come from a working class background. My father was a house painter. We grew up with a lot of challenges. I was a child of the Great Society. Head Start, food stamps, and Pell Grants are what made me successful to the extent that I have been. One of the things we need to help folks understand is that trans women and trans men didn't take away your health care. Trans men and trans women did not close your factory. Trans men and trans women did not plunder your pension. Plutocrats who don't want to pay their taxes and don't want to live under any regulations did those things. So ask yourself, who has really threatened your lifestyle, your ability to survive? Not people from the LGBTQ community, but folks who don't want there to be a government and want to privatize everything because that's how they get wealthier on your back. I wish I had an easy answer to how we convince folks of that, but that's part of it, absolutely.
I'll just say that one of the other dimensions of this is that the funding comes from those elite sources, those overwhelmingly plutocratic sources, in ways that it even masks how the movement itself understands its inner dynamics. So what am I talking about? Every 10 years there's a story in the Times or somewhere about the new right? I mean, I don't know how many new rights we've had just in my lifetime, 3 or 4, right? And about a year ago, somebody wrote to me and said, hey, can you write about this? Because there's somebody claiming it's the new right. And what they were saying is the new right is no longer religious. We just oppose trans people and, want to ban books. There's nothing religious about that. And my response in my writing was, what's tragically genius here is that all of those things came from the playbook of the religious right. I mean, we could look at 1955, 1965, 1970. Like historically, they're all there, and yet the young up and comers were supposedly the face of the new right, this new audacious conservative social movement, don't even realize in their own movement. And so when people ask me about Christian nationalism, I'm like, there's something genius about that you can foster an identity so divorced from the sort of religious roots that found a movement and spread to a 28-year-old in New York City who's touted as the new face of the GOP, somebody who says, I'm not religious at all, has no idea that their positions were cultivated from religious sources, and yet is out there fighting the same culture war in the 3rd or 4th generation. There's something tragically genius about that. So on that very happy note, I think we're at time. And so I just want to say thank you to Andrew, to Rob, to Katherine for all their brilliance, and let's thank them. There are books for sale in the back, so if you'd like to check any of our books out, they're all back there, and we'll be around to sign books if you'd like. Otherwise, we'll see you all soon.